At the beginning of the 19th century, as the United States was still struggling to define its identity after independence, one immigrant family from Europe quietly laid the foundation for an empire built not only on wealth, but on enduring presence within the power structure of the new nation. That family bore the name DuPont, a name that, over the next 2 centuries, would become inseparable from gunpowder, chemicals, war, industrialization, politics, and ultimately a series of deaths that caused history to pause at the boundary between official records and silence. The man who laid the first stone of that empire was Éluthère René DuPont, a French chemist who fled the French Revolution carrying with him scientific knowledge, political connections, and an almost religious belief that industry could become a new form of order to replace the fallen aristocracy. When he arrived on the eastern shores of the United States in the year 1800, he was not merely seeking safety. He was searching for a space where science, capital, and power could merge into a single force. Along the banks of Brandywine Creek in the state of Delaware, he built his first gunpowder mills, structures that lacked the grandeur of European palaces, yet contained the latent violence of a new age. From slowly turning water wheels and carefully concealed powder magazines nestled in the valley, the DuPont family began binding its fate to that of the United States itself. The War of 1812. The American Civil War. Conflicts in which gunpowder became indispensable. Every shot fired on distant battlefields could be traced back to those quiet mills along the Brandywine. From the very beginning, the empire carried a contradiction within it. Outwardly, the DuPont family was seen as a symbol of progress, science, and order. Inwardly, they lived within a closed world, where marriages were calculated, assets tightly controlled, and the family name valued above individual lives. Vast estates rose not merely as residences, but as psychological fortresses, isolating the family from wider society, while shielding anything that could never be allowed to become a public story. Throughout the 19th century, the DuPont family expanded its influence both horizontally and vertically. The DuPont Company did not merely produce gunpowder. It gradually became a chemical empire supplying materials for agriculture, construction, the military, and eventually modern consumer life. Yet running parallel to this expansion was a series of internal tragedies, suicides, accidents, and unexplained deaths that began appearing in family records, often noted in brief, sparse lines, stripped of detail and rarely explained in public. At that stage, these deaths did not yet form a recognizable pattern. They were regarded as isolated personal tragedies, individuals unable to withstand the pressure of privilege and expectation. What drew attention, however, was how the family responded. There were no public investigations, no prolonged legal disputes, no memoirs or confessions. Everything was handled swiftly, discreetly, and always within the family's control. The silence was not accidental. It was part of a culture of power, a belief that the survival of the family mattered more than the truth of any single life. As the 20th century began and the United States transformed into a global industrial power, the DuPont family was no longer merely a group of manufacturers. They had become something closer to an industrial aristocracy, owners of land and capital, wielders of political influence, connected through dense networks to the federal government. Estates such as Nemers and the properties surrounding what is now the Hagley Museum and Library were not simply displays of wealth. They were symbols of a family order sustained through strict discipline and unwritten rules. It was within this context that the family's mysterious deaths took on a different meaning. No longer isolated incidents, they gradually formed a recurring sequence: young heirs dying suddenly, suicides clouded by doubt, hunting or automobile accidents occurring under unclear circumstances, and coroners' reports that left more questions than answers. Each time, the family closed ranks, and official history continued forward as though nothing unusual had occurred. This opening chapter does not seek to accuse or to indulge in sensational theories. It establishes a necessary foundation that the DuPont family was not merely wealthy, but a long-lasting structure of power capable of shaping how truth was recorded, how tragedy was interpreted, and how death itself could fade from collective memory. Before examining individual cases, specific people, circumstances, and troubling details, we must understand the environment that produced them, a world in which family honor and economic power could blur the line between what happened and what was permitted to be known. In the next part, the story will move away from the broad historical canvas and focus on individuals' heirs, marginal figures, And the earliest deaths that began to prompt historians to ask a quiet but unsettling question: were these merely the tragedies of a closed family, or the signs of a system in which silence functioned as a tool of survival? By the closing decades of the 19th century, the DuPont family had reached a condition few American families of the time could even imagine. Wealth was no longer a goal, but the default state of existence. Children born into the family grew up amid vast estates, libraries filled with scientific and philosophical works, and dinner tables where conversation revolved around war, government contracts, and the fate of the company. Yet within this seemingly safe and privileged world, an invisible pressure steadily took shape, the pressure to be worthy of a name that had become a national symbol. DuPont heirs were not raised to live as independent individuals. They were trained to become links in a long generational chain, where every personal decision could be interpreted as affecting the family's collective reputation. Marriage was rarely only about affection. Careers were rarely purely personal choices. Even inner states of mind, depression, anxiety, doubt were treated as conditions that could not be allowed to exist in public view. In such a world, failure was not merely a private shame, it was a threat to the family order itself. Archival records from the late 19th century reveal a striking reality. The number of early deaths within the family rose noticeably, particularly among younger heirs. Many cases were recorded as accidents, falls from horses, hunting incidents, or mishaps on family estates, but the files were often thin on detail, and any investigations that did occur tended to conclude quickly. Given a family so deeply connected to local authorities and the legal system, such speed was not surprising. What is notable is that it left behind gaps that later generations could not help but question. One of the most distinctive features of these tragedies was the repetition of place. Many deaths occurred within the boundaries of family estate spaces deliberately designed to separate the family from the outside world. Private forests, deserted riding paths, isolated studies within large mansions. These were ideal settings for privacy, but also places where the truth, if complicated, could easily remain confined within four walls. When news did reach the outside world, it was usually delivered through brief, emotionless statements, as though death itself were only a minor interruption in the family's uninterrupted continuity. Later social historians, working through these fragmentary records, began to recognize a psychological pattern rather than a clear conspiracy. The DuPont family functioned more like an institution than a family in the ordinary sense. Within that institution, individuals who did not fully conform, those who were sensitive, artistic, or simply unsuited to prescribed roles, were often pushed to the margins, both emotionally and physically. That isolation, combined with relentless expectations and constant scrutiny, created an environment in which tragedy could emerge without the visible hand of violence. What makes these deaths so difficult to explain is not only the circumstances, but how they were remembered, or more precisely, how they were not remembered. There were no grand family memorials, no tradition of retelling stories about those who had died. Instead, there was a cold continuity. Assets were transferred, positions within the company were filled, and social life proceeded as if no space had just opened. In some cases, the names of the deceased gradually disappeared from family documents, as though they had never existed at all. This silence had lasting consequences. It did more than protect the family's reputation at the time, it shaped how history would later approach them. With no internal narratives to draw upon, researchers were forced to rely on legal files, brief newspaper notices, and marginal archival notes, fragments that could never form a complete picture. It was this absence that turned the DuPont deaths into things never explained, not because no truth existed, but because that truth was locked within a structure of power that discouraged disclosure. By the end of this part, the point is not to decide guilt or innocence, nor to label these tragedies with sensational terms. The crucial realization is that, from an early stage, the DuPont family built a system for managing loss, controlling information, minimizing public emotion, and prioritizing the continuity of the empire over individual grief. That system would carry them into the 20th century, a time when mass media, independent investigation, and public pressure would make the preservation of silence increasingly difficult. In the next part, the story will move into the period when the deaths of the DuPont family could no longer be contained within internal records, when the press began to pay attention, and when wealth, rather than shielding the family, became the very reason each tragedy was examined under the light of suspicion. As the early decades of the 20th century began, the United States was changing at a pace that even its most powerful families could not ignore. Mass journalism expanded, legal systems became more standardized, and a new public consciousness began asking questions about how power operated behind names once considered untouchable. For the DuPont family, this marked the moment when a strategy of silence, one that had protected them for generations, first encountered clear limits. Deaths that had once been handled as strictly internal matters could no longer be easily sealed within family files. Local newspapers in Delaware, long dependent on DuPont advertising and economic influence, began to feel pressure from regional and national competitors. Every recorded accident, every reported suicide, carried the risk of becoming a story that traveled beyond familiar community boundaries, especially when the deceased was an heir or a prominent family member. In this environment, a new pattern emerged. News reports became more detailed, yet still stopped short of danger. Phrases such as unclear circumstances, preliminary investigation, or no evidence of criminal activity appeared again and again. What mattered most was not what was written, but what was never pursued to the end. Hearings rarely extended for long. Witnesses were seldom called. Coroner's reports often concluded with open-ended findings, allowing the story to close without a full explanation. This caution did not stem solely from fear. It reflected a structural reality. The DuPont family was not merely wealthy, they were an economic pillar of an entire region. Thousands of jobs, local budgets, and even public projects depended on the family's stability. In that context, probing too deeply into a personal tragedy could be seen as a threat to the common good. Self-censorship by the press and local authorities thus became part of the ecosystem of power, no direct orders required, only an unspoken understanding. Yet it was the expansion of DuPont influence beyond Delaware that created cracks in that system. As family members traveled, studied, and lived in larger urban centers where economic relationships were no longer exclusive, the same protective networks did not apply. In those places, reporters were less constrained, and editors more willing to ask questions local papers avoided. Each such article, however cautious, gradually weakened the shell of silence. Alongside media pressure came internal change. A new generation grew up in a more modern America, exposed to psychology and emerging ideas about mental health concepts earlier generations had regarded as signs of weakness. Some family members began keeping journals, writing letters to friends outside the family, or seeking medical treatment for mental states long concealed. These personal fragments, rare and incomplete, later became invaluable to researchers, because they offered voices different from official statements. It was during this period that observers began to notice the widening gap between the family's public image and its private reality. Outwardly, DuPont continued to be praised as a symbol of science, order, and national contribution. Inwardly, tensions accumulated across generations, often revealing themselves only through tragic outcomes. Each death, whether labeled an accident or a suicide, left a residue not in headlines, but in how the family adjusted its behavior, tightened control over information, and reinforced internal boundaries. It is crucial to understand that at this stage there was still no single case, in the legal or criminal sense, large enough to shatter the family's defenses. Instead, there was a steady sequence of small challenges, like hairline cracks in a thick stone wall. Each crack alone caused no collapse, but together they altered how the structure bore weight. Eventually, one sufficiently large event could place the entire architecture of silence at risk. This part of the story does not end with a shocking revelation, but with a shift in state. The DuPont family entered the 20th century with a new awareness. Economic power and historical prestige were no longer absolute shields against public scrutiny. The deaths that were never explained were no longer purely internal matters. They had become unanswered questions suspended in the public sphere, unresolved, yet impossible to fully forget. In the next part, the narrative will focus on more specific cases, deaths that began to draw national attention, and how each incident forced the DuPont family to adapt its strategies in an America increasingly unwilling to accept silence as the final answer. The 1920s opened with the false optimism of post-war America, a period when industry surged, financial markets expanded rapidly, and major industrial families were regarded as pillars of national stability. For the DuPont family, this was a moment of peak power. The DuPont company expanded into new materials, modern scientific research, and increasingly large defense contracts. Yet it was precisely during this era of prosperity that internal tragedies began to take on a different form. They were no longer vague accidents whispered about within local communities, but events that compelled national media attention. The difference lay in both context and visibility. Some of the victims were no longer secluded figures living quietly on family estates, but individuals active in public life, attending social galas, serving on corporate boards, or participating in charitable organizations bearing the family name. When people like this died suddenly, the familiar strategy of silence became harder to sustain. News traveled faster, crossing the borders of Delaware, and each report carried questions that had never before been openly asked. Records from this period reveal a subtle shift in how authorities responded. Investigations were more formally opened, coroners' reports grew longer, and official statements became more cautious in tone. Yet the final outcomes remained familiar. There were no criminal charges, no prolonged trials, and no definitive conclusions beyond the phrase insufficient evidence. This did not necessarily point to direct interference, but it reflected a more complex reality. When a family holds economic and social influence at a certain scale, the surrounding systems tend to choose stability over confrontation. What made the deaths of this period more striking was the emergence of contradictions among sources. Different newspapers sometimes offered conflicting accounts of the same event, disagreeing on timelines, witnesses, or the circumstances leading to death. These discrepancies were rarely resolved in public. Instead, they remained side by side in newspaper archives, like layers of historical sediment never fully excavated. For later researchers, such small inconsistencies became signs of how tightly the narrative had once been managed. Within the family itself, the response to growing pressure was not openness, but reorganization. Control over information became increasingly centralized in the hands of a few senior figures. Family attorneys and public relations advisors assumed more prominent roles, not only in business matters but in moments of private crisis. Younger members were encouraged or required to avoid the press, limit public appearances, and resolve personal difficulties with the greatest possible discretion. This professionalization produced a new paradox. The more rigorously the Pont family attempted to control the narrative, the more they inadvertently acknowledged that the narrative mattered. The presence of lawyers and carefully worded statements, neutral and brief though they were, signaled to the public that these were not merely random misfortunes. Each time a death was explained using the same linguistic template, repetition itself became a marker not of crime, but of a standardized system of response. This part of the story also reflects a broader shift in American public attitudes. In a society increasingly accustomed to questioning large corporations and wealthy families, automatic trust no longer prevailed. The unanswered questions surrounding deaths within the Pont family became symbolic of a wider unease. Could economic power shape how truth was presented to the public? Even without concrete proof, that suspicion alone was enough to weaken the image of invulnerability the family had long maintained. As the 1920s drew to a close and larger upheavals loomed ahead, the Pont family entered a phase of more sophisticated defense, not only against the press, but against history itself. The deaths that were never explained were no longer simply family memories. They had become blurred points in the national record, ready to be re-examined whenever American society revisited the relationship between power, wealth, and public responsibility. In the next part, the story will move into a closer examination of specific cases from the mid-century period deaths documented in greater detail, leaving clearer traces behind, and therefore posing a greater threat to the long-standing strategy of silence maintained by the Pont family. As the United States entered the prolonged instability stretching from the late 1920s into the 1930s, the broader historical landscape changed profoundly. The Great Depression did more than shake the economy. It shattered confidence in structures of power once considered unassailable. In this climate, the personal tragedies of major families were no longer viewed as purely private matters. For the Pont family, this was the moment when deaths ceased to be anonymous entries in statistics and became attached to specific names, individuals with identifiable backgrounds, roles, and positions within both the family and society. Records from this period show a marked increase in apparent detail. Times of death were recorded more precisely. Locations were described with greater specificity. Witnesses, however few, began to appear in official reports. Yet it was precisely this surface completeness that threw the core gaps into sharper relief. Motives remained unclear. The sequence of events leading to death was often broken at its most critical point. And legal conclusions, though longer and more formal, continued to avoid the questions most likely to provoke public controversy. A recurring feature of these cases was the overlap between private life and family obligation. Many of the victims were described as standing at a crossroads preparing to assume greater responsibility within the DuPont company, or attempting to step away from a predetermined path. In a family that treated continuity as a supreme value, such choices often generated quiet, sustained tension. The private materials that survived, letters, personal notes, indirect testimony, suggest states of emotional instability, but never enough to support a definitive conclusion. They point only to one fact: these deaths did not occur in a vacuum, but within an environment of prolonged pressure. The locations where these tragedies unfolded carried symbolic weight as well. They were not crowded public spaces, but private offices, deserted estate roads, or seldom used rooms within vast mansions. These were places of maximum privacy, and also places where complex truths could be most easily contained. When journalists approached these sites, they were usually met with exterior images: alone closed iron gates, dense rows of trees, and brief statements issued by family representatives. What makes these cases especially significant for historians is how they were remembered over time. Unlike the early tragedies of the 19th century, these deaths left clear traces in National Archives, major newspapers, coroner's files, and occasionally court documents. Yet despite the abundance of sources, a final answer never emerged. The richness of documentation did not produce clarity, it only underscored the absence of a single, convincing explanation. Within the family, the response to this sequence of losses became more personalized, yet also more tightly controlled. Decisions about inheritance, asset distribution, and managerial roles were adjusted swiftly after each death, as if to seal the gap before it could become a public issue. That speed, organizationally efficient, created a chilling impression for outsiders, reinforcing the sense that individual lives consistently ranked behind the durability of the empire. This part of the story offers no final verdict on any single case. Instead, it marks a critical turning point. From this moment on, every death within the DuPont family carried a file, witnesses, and a timeline, yet still lacked what history seeks most persistently: a persuasive explanation. These deaths became emblematic of a broader 20th century phenomenon. When power reaches a certain scale, truth does not need to be distorted, it only needs to be left incomplete. In the next part, the narrative will move further still, into a period when these deaths began to be reconsidered not merely as family tragedies, but as expressions of a social structure, one in which wealth, reputation, and control of information coexist, creating shadows that history struggles to illuminate fully. After the Second World War, the United States entered a new era, an era of victory, mass consumption, and deep confidence in science, technology, and large corporations. Within this context, the DuPont family not only survived the upheavals of the early 20th century, but moved into a phase of consolidated national power. The DuPont Company became a symbol of modern America, associated with new materials, pioneering research, and a strategic role in Cold War defense. Yet it was precisely when this public image reached its most polished form that history began to turn back slowly, cautiously, to examine the darker spaces that had been passed over. Unlike the sensational journalism of earlier decades, this post-war questioning unfolded within academic and archival spaces. Historians, sociologists, and investigative journalists began working through family papers, old legal records, and scattered press accounts, not to uncover a specific crime, but to understand a pattern. The question was no longer what happened in each individual death, but rather why these deaths, despite extensive documentation, were never explained in a satisfying way. A key feature of this period was a shift in public ethics. Post-war America began speaking more openly about mental health, social pressure, and the cost of success. What had once been dismissed as personal weakness was increasingly understood as the result of family structures and social expectations. As scholars reread letters, diaries, and medical reports connected to deceased members of the DuPont family, a familiar pattern emerged: a feeling of being trapped between family obligation and personal identity, a conflict rarely acknowledged in public, yet repeatedly present in private materials. It was here that estates and archival spaces became silent witnesses to history. Places such as the Hagley Museum and Library did not merely display industrial achievements, they preserved fragile traces: unsent letters, personal notes, meeting minutes that revealed the complex inner lives behind the facade of order. Taken together, These fragments accused no one, but they weakened the assumption that all tragedies were random or accidental. During this period, the DuPont family responded by shifting focus from press control to legacy management. Family history was reframed to emphasize scientific contribution, social responsibility, and continuity across generations. The deaths that were never explained were not denied, but neither were they explored in depth. They existed as footnotes acknowledged enough to avoid accusations of concealment, yet never allowed to move to the center of the official narrative. Notably, this transformation unfolded alongside the maturation of corporate history as a field of study in the United States. Scholars began viewing industrial families as closed social systems, in which power, wealth, and emotion were governed by internal rules. Within that framework, the DuPont family became a representative case not because of the number of tragedies, but because of its capacity to maintain silence systematically over long periods. That silence was no longer understood as conspiracy, but as the product of a culture that placed stability above all else. This section marks a subtle but significant turning point. The deaths were no longer entirely forgotten, yet they were never decoded. They were placed within the broader context of 20th century America, a society that learned to celebrate collective success, sometimes by overlooking individual loss. In that process, the DuPont family became a mirror reflecting an uncomfortable question: can an industrial civilization move forward without leaving human lives crushed in silence? In the next part, the story will move toward its final stage when legacy, memory, and unanswered questions collide with modern demands for transparency, accountability, and historical truth. As the second half of the 20th century unfolded, the DuPont family no longer appeared before the public as a living, breathing family, but as a historical concept, a symbol of industrial America, applied science, and power accumulated across generations. Old factories became museums. Estates were open to visitors, and the official story was retold in the language of order, progress, and achievement. Yet within this transformation, the deaths that were never explained emerged as blurred, difficult to ignore points no longer legal or journalistic problems, but problems of memory. Legacy, in this case, was not simply a matter of wealth or name. It was the way a family chose what would be remembered and what would be allowed to drift into silence. DuPont memorial spaces, libraries, exhibition halls, archival collections were designed to tell a coherent story of national contribution. But history, when placed inside a museum, is always the result of selection. What is not displayed is not necessarily false. Sometimes it is simply too difficult to frame. Contemporary historians approaching these collections came to recognize that the family's mysterious deaths were rarely denied. They were acknowledged as personal tragedies, separated from structures of power and family culture. This approach, while reasonable on the surface, unintentionally severed the most important connection: that these tragedies occurred within a system governed by its own rules, where expectation, control, and reputation formed a shared environment. Once that connection was removed, death became an isolated event, and history became easier to tell. Places such as Nemmer's estate and the Hagley Museum and Library played a dual role in this story. They functioned both as sites of preservation and as filters of memory. Visitors passed through grand halls, read about inventions and social contributions, and rarely encountered the question of what happened to those who did not fit the narrative of success. That absence was not the result of crude concealment. It was the product of a long-standing tradition, one that prioritized narrative stability over the complexity of human life. On a broader level, the DuPont case reflects a fundamental problem in American history. Industrial civilization in the United States was built on the belief that collective progress could justify individual loss. When that progress succeeded, those losses were often treated as unavoidable costs. The deaths that were never explained, therefore, were not merely family mysteries. They were traces of an era that accepted silence as the price of stability and growth. This section does not attempt to issue belated judgments. There is no new evidence to reopen the files, no buried confession waiting in the archives. Instead, it raises a different question, one perhaps more relevant to the present. What do we expect from history? Is history meant to affirm stories of success, or to remind us that even the most perfectly organized empires are built from fragile human lives? Seen from the distance of the 21st century, the unexplained deaths of the DuPont family no longer shock in a sensational sense. They haunt in a different way as empty spaces on the map of memory, where the reader is forced to pause and ask what was never said. It is within these spaces that history becomes more honest, not because it offers answers, but because it acknowledges its own limits. In the next and final part, the story will close by placing the DuPont family within the larger landscape of American history as evidence of organizational power and as a reminder that no legacy is ever complete while questions about human lives remain unresolved. When this story reaches its stopping point, what remains is not a clear conclusion, but a suspended state, much like the very records that have followed the DuPont family for more than 2 centuries. History, in this case, does not act as a judge. It neither convicts nor absolves. It simply places the fragments on the table, enough for us to recognize the shape of a durable structure of power, one in which silence once functioned as a condition for maintaining order. The DuPont family helped shape modern America from wartime gunpowder to chemicals, materials, and applied science. Those contributions are real, documented, and preserved in places such as the Hagley Museum and Library, and in the estates that once stood at the center of family life. Yet running alongside that story of progress is a sequence of personal losses, never fully explained lives that disappeared from the official narrative, leaving gaps that history cannot fill with numbers or achievements alone. What invites reflection is not whether a single hidden secret exists, but how a system can operate so smoothly once it learns how to absorb tragedy without disrupting itself. In such a system, death does not need to be denied. It only needs to be rearranged, moved to the margins, detached from structural causes, and labeled as a personal misfortune. Repeated over generations, this process produced what we now call the deaths that were never explained. As estates become museums and old factories turn into landmarks, memory is framed in ways that are easier to accept. Visitors walk through grand halls and read about science and innovation, but are rarely invited to pause over the human cost that made those achievements possible. Not because the question is forbidden, but because it makes the story harder to tell, less comforting, and less complete by the traditional standards of legacy. From a modern perspective, the story of the DuPont family is no longer an exception. It reflects a broader rule of industrial history. When power grows large enough, it does not need to bend the truth. It only needs to control the pace and scope at which the truth is spoken. The resulting gaps are not failures of history, but traces of how history itself is formed by people, shaped by their priorities, fears, and need for stability. Perhaps the greatest value of this story lies precisely in the absence of answers. It forces the viewer to do what the records cannot do on their own, to stop, to reflect, and to accept that not every question can be resolved. In a world where legacy is often narrated in the language of triumph, acknowledging these dark spaces, lives left unexplained, is a human act. It reminds us that history is not only about achievements, but also about what was left behind in order to build them. As the screen fades to black and the story closes, the DuPont family does not appear as heroes or villains. They appear as evidence of the power of human organization and of its limits. An empire may endure across generations, but the questions about the people within it will always wait to be heard, even when they are never answered. After the official narratives have closed, after museums shut their doors and the lights in the great estates slowly fade, history does not disappear. It merely changes form. In the case of the DuPont family, what remains is not a hidden secret waiting to be revealed, but a lingering question about how society chooses its memories. The deaths that were never explained do not sit at the center of American history, yet they persist at its edges where history and ethics intersect without ever fully meeting. In the 21st century, as archives become increasingly digitized and open to the public, access to records has never been greater. But abundance of data does not equal clarity. Coroner's reports still end with familiar conclusions. Personal correspondence still stops short of confession. Internal memoranda, however detailed, continue to avoid the deepest causes. Here, history is not forbidden, it is fragmented, and it is precisely that fragmentation that makes full understanding impossible. This raises a larger issue that extends beyond the DuPont family. In modern society, we often assume transparency to be the natural outcome of progress. Yet this case reveals a paradox. The more systems are built to record and preserve information, the more sophisticated the capacity for organized silence becomes. Documents need not be destroyed. They only need to exist without ever being connected into a complete narrative. These gaps are not accidental. They reflect the way history is prioritized through the lens of achievement, innovation, and stability. Stories that do not serve that order, personal tragedies that lead to no reform or clear lesson, are often pushed to the margins. For the DuPont family, the unexplained deaths became part of what might be called historical noise, recorded, but not interpreted, known, but not emphasized. Contemporary scholars revisiting this phenomenon are no longer searching for a final answer. Instead, they ask about the responsibility of the historical storyteller. Is history meant to soothe society with seamless narratives, or to preserve points of rupture, places where the story cannot proceed without acknowledging human loss? Within this frame, the DuPont family is no longer on trial, but becomes a case study in how power shapes collective memory. This section, therefore, introduces no new facts. It introduces a deliberate pause. A pause meant to recognize that some stories do not end with conclusions, but with responsibility placed on the listener. When history offers no answers, silence itself forces us to consider what we expect from the past: comfort or honesty. And perhaps the most important point is this: the deaths that were never explained do not weaken the history of the DuPont family. They make that history more human. For wherever power endures, there will always be lives lived in its shadow, not to be judged, but to be remembered, even if only through an unanswered question. If the story continues beyond this point, it will no longer move deeper into the DuPont family alone. It will widen the lens, placing them alongside other American industrial dynasties, to show that this silence was not an exception, but a pattern of an entire era. When the DuPont family is placed within the broader landscape of American history, what emerges is not a strange exception, but a familiar pattern of the industrial age. From the late 19th century to the mid-20th century, the United States witnessed the rise of families whose power rested not on crowns or royal bloodlines, but on capital, technology, and organizational capacity. Other names such as John D. Rockefeller or Cornelius Vanderbilt are often told through the language of success and philanthropy. Yet behind those narratives lie similar shadows: family tragedies, early deaths, and a tradition of silence sustained by reputation and influence. What these families shared was not the number of tragedies they endured, but the way those tragedies were handled. In a society where family enterprises were tightly bound to national interests, the stability of the empire was routinely placed above personal emotion. Unusual deaths, whether accidents, suicides, or vaguely defined illnesses, were recorded quickly, explained minimally, and then absorbed into the machinery of continuity. Official history, as a result, moved forward without pausing at its fractures. The grand estates of this era, from Kikuit to the mansions of the Vanderbilt family, were built not only to display wealth, but to create enclosed worlds. Within those spaces, family life unfolded apart from the wider society, and it was there that tragedy could be kept as a private matter. When information did escape, it was often softened by neutral language and by deference to the family's great contributions to the nation. This reflected an unspoken compromise within industrial-era America. In exchange for growth, employment, and national strength, the public accepted a certain degree of obscurity surrounding the private lives of tycoons. The press, the legal system, and even academia, at least in the early stages, operated within the boundaries of that compromise. Questions that cut too deeply were not forbidden, but they were often dismissed as unnecessary or even destabilizing. Seen from the present, this pattern helps explain why the deaths within the DuPont family were never fully resolved. They were not hidden in isolation. They were embedded within a broader culture in which silence functioned as a tool of governance. In that culture, choosing not to ask questions could be framed as a civic virtue, because asking them might undermine confidence in the nation's economic pillars. This section therefore widens the lens. The DuPont family is not simply the subject of a singular tragedy, but one chapter in the longer history of industrial America, where family power, legacy, and memory were shaped by the same logic. When these families are viewed side by side, what stands out is not their differences, but a troubling similarity in how history has been told, and in what has been left behind. In the next and final part, the story will return once more to the DuPont family with a concluding perspective. If silence was a pattern of the era, what responsibility does the present bear? How should we read these historical gaps, and does rereading them still matter when the witnesses are gone? When the last witnesses have fallen silent and official records stop at the boundary of insufficient data, history does not end. It merely transfers responsibility. That responsibility no longer belongs to the DuPont family, those who lived, made decisions, and died within the conditions of their own time, but to today's readers, researchers, and storytellers. The question, then, is no longer whether we can uncover a complete truth, but how we choose to face what is missing. In the 21st century, transparency is treated as an ethical standard. We are accustomed to independent investigations, open archives, and the belief that if we dig deeply enough, answers will eventually emerge. The DuPont case challenges that belief. It shows that some histories are shaped not by what was hidden, but by what was never spoken: emotions, pressures, and personal choices that left no administrative trace. When confronting this kind of past, insisting on a single definitive conclusion can cause us to miss something more important: understanding the context that made silence a rational choice for those involved. Modern archival spaces such as the Hagley Museum and Library have taken on a new role. They are not only places that preserve achievements, but places that allow difficult questions to exist alongside the official narrative. Displaying an unfinished letter, a meeting record that ends abruptly, or a personal note that received no reply is, in itself, a historical statement that the past is not always complete, and that honesty sometimes lies in acknowledging limits. This creates a delicate responsibility for the storyteller. In a world that favors clarity and dramatic resolution, telling stories built around gaps, deaths that were never explained requires ethical discipline. Not inventing theories to satisfy curiosity, not assigning blame where evidence does not exist, but also not flattening the narrative by stripping humanity from names, dates, and numbers. The responsibility is to keep the question alive, even when the answer never arrives. When the DuPont family is placed back into the broader context of American history, this section closes a conceptual circle opened at the beginning. Long-lasting power produces enduring forms of silence. That silence is not necessarily the result of malice. It is often the outcome of systems that place stability above all else. Recognizing this does not lessen the pain of personal loss, but it helps us resist the temptation to simplify history into stories of villains and heroes. In the end, what remains after all these parts is not a solution, but a way of reading the past. That way demands patience, humility, and a willingness to accept that some gaps cannot be filled with documentation. The DuPont family's unexplained deaths thus become a lasting reminder: history is not only what we know, but also what we choose not to pretend we know. If this story holds value, it lies in the act of looking directly at the limits of understanding and still continuing to tell, to remember, and to question. Not to accuse, but to ensure that human memory is not entirely consumed by narratives of success that are too perfectly complete. After the final image fades, after the narration falls silent and the music recedes, the documentary does not truly end. It changes its subject. From that moment on, the story leaves the archives, the estates, and the museums, and enters the mind of the viewer, where questions continue to exist without the need for immediate answers. For the DuPont family, this epilogue does not seek to uncover a new secret. It affirms a simpler, more difficult truth: some histories were never meant to be neatly closed. Documentary film, in this case, does not act as judge or prosecutor. It becomes an in-between space where verified facts stand alongside gaps that cannot be filled. When the deaths that were never explained are told in a measured rhythm and careful language, the film chooses to respect human fragility rather than satisfy curiosity. That choice may leave the viewer feeling the absence of a climax, but that very absence is the message. Honest history does not always deliver a sense of completion. As viewers, our responsibility is no longer to find the correct answer, but to learn how to remain with the question. To remain with the idea that long-term power can generate enduring forms of silence. To remain with the awareness that the most dazzling achievements of an industrial empire can exist alongside private losses that were never named. And to remain with the understanding that collective memory is built not only from what is told, but also from what is omitted. Places such as the Hagley Museum and Library stand as bridges between two worlds: the world of evidence and the world of interpretation. There, the viewer encounters a difficult lesson that opening an archive does not mean revealing a complete truth. What opens instead is the possibility of dialogue between past and present, between achievement and loss, between what is known and what can only be responsibly inferred. This epilogue, therefore, adds no new facts. It returns the decision to the viewer, whether to read history as a tidy heroic narrative, or to accept it as an unfinished composition, where a few low notes are never explained but still must be heard. In that choice, History becomes an ethical act not because it judges, but because it refuses to claim knowledge beyond what evidence allows. When the lights in the theater come back on, the DuPont family no longer stands at the center of the frame. What remains is a question that applies to every story of power and legacy. Do we tell the past to affirm greatness, or to make room for human beings even when those human beings are present only as silence? If this film has a final word, it is that quiet invitation. There is something history rarely admits openly: not every story exists to be resolved. Some exist only to be carried forward. The DuPont family, after everything that has been recorded, preserved, and analyzed, leaves behind not only an industrial legacy, but a very specific kind of silence, a silence that was constructed, maintained, and passed down as part of an ordered system. In the modern world, where data is revered and transparency is treated as a moral ideal, that silence unsettles us. It runs against our instinct to search for answers. Yet that discomfort is precisely the proof that this story is still alive. Not in the files, but in the way it forces us to confront the limits of history itself. The deaths that were never explained within the DuPont family do not ask for sympathy, nor do they demand belated judgment. What they ask for is clarity of mind. Clarity to recognize that power, when sustained across generations, does not merely organize production and wealth, it also organizes memory. It determines what is repeated, what is softened, and what is allowed to disappear without causing disruption. When we tell this story today, the important thing is not to choose a side, but to understand our own role. The viewer is no longer a passive observer. They become the final resting place of history, the place where unanswered questions are no longer buried again. In this case, listening itself becomes an act, and perhaps this is the deepest legacy the story leaves behind: not a warning, but a habit of thought. A habit of distrusting stories that feel too complete. A habit of leaving room for silences, for people who no longer have a voice, and for the things history cannot or chooses not to say. When the film ends completely, when there are no more images or sounds to guide us, what remains is not the DuPont family. What remains is an open question addressed to every modern society: how much are we truly willing to know about the real cost of stability and success? And if some answers never appear, do we have the courage not to replace them with more comforting stories? In that silence, history does not disappear. It waits to be heard, not to be closed, but to remind us that behind every enduring empire, there are always things that were never spoken. And remembering them, even only through silence, is itself a form of belated justice. There is a moment every historical documentary must face: the moment when the story no longer belongs to the past, but begins to reflect the present. When the names, the dates, and the places have all been told, what remains is not information, but feeling. In the case of the DuPont family, that feeling is neither shock nor outrage. It is a prolonged silence, long enough for the viewer to realize that history sometimes does not want to be explained, but to be remembered properly. In today's world, where every story is pushed toward rapid conclusions, the absence of answers is often treated as failure. But history does not operate by the logic of news or entertainment. It operates by the logic of time, and time does not always give us clarity, it gives us responsibility. That responsibility lies in how we tell stories like this one. Not to tear down monuments, but not to polish them either. Instead, to place them in the right light, a light honest enough to reveal what is imperfect. The DuPont family, like many industrial dynasties in American history, succeeded in organizing the material world. Yet that very success exposes a deeper limitation: no structure of power is complete enough to fully resolve the human losses it creates. The deaths that were never explained no longer require a conclusion. They have existed long enough to become part of historical memory, not as criminal cases, but as moral questions. Questions about how many individuals a society is willing to sacrifice to preserve a sense of stability. Questions about how easily we accept silence when that silence arrives alongside growth, employment, and progress. Looking back, what makes this story haunting is not the number of tragedies, but their familiarity. There is nothing extraordinary, no sudden shock, only a pattern repeated so often that it becomes invisible. And it is precisely that invisibility that is most dangerous, because what goes unseen is often what endures the longest. At this final point, the film does not ask the viewer to remember every detail. It asks for something simpler, and far more difficult. Do not forget that history is built not only from what is spoken, but from what is left behind. Every gap, every unfinished conclusion, Every file closed too early is part of the story, even when it is never named. And if there is a reason to tell the story of the Pont family today, it is not to assign new blame to the past, but to better understand the present. Because the structures that produced silence yesterday still exist today, only under new names, in new contexts, and in more refined forms. When the screen finally goes dark, and no narration remains, the film completes its final task, returning silence to the viewer. But this is not an empty silence. It is a silence filled with awareness that some stories do not need to be finished, because it is precisely their lack of an ending that allows them to continue to matter.